Hi, this is George Mueller, and we're back with another video intro. My apologies for getting this one up a little late. I'm still just getting my voice back, and you're going to hear me cough several times during this. You may also hear attacks by my cats. But let's talk a little bit about the progressive movement. So the progressive movement is especially important right now because in many ways we're in the middle or possibly at the tail end of a second progressive movement. That'll become more clear as you read a little bit more about this movement. Now, progressivism, at least in the early 20th century, was generally tied in with young, mainly middle-class Protestants. And it was very closely tied to those groups. William Jennings Bryan was a good example, and there was a social gospel movement that called for people to apply Christian morals to the political world. And so this was an attempt to moralize as well as rationalize politics. Now, one of the other things that plays into this is the rise of a number of movements in literature. One is the vast increase in the number of magazines available. People in the 19th century read magazines voraciously. New printing techniques had made them much cheaper in the late 20th century. Pardon me. But in the late 19th century, but in the early 20th century, things got much less expensive. So magazines became available to pretty much everybody. One of the things that happened is you started to have a new group of people who were trying to get views by doing what was called investigative journalism. And they were particularly looking at problems in society. And many people derided these new reporters as muckrakers. And part of the reason they existed is the printing press had gotten much cheaper, and so there was much more accessibility for more people to publish magazines. This might sound familiar. Mass circulation of magazines spread their work, and it helped. One of the things that helped it was a rise in an artistic movement called realism. Realism looked at the sordid and dirty and decayed side of the world. Before this, in the Romantic era and then in the Enlightenment, artists sought to portray an idealized version of the world. The realists showed, I'm going to do air quotes, the real world. There was also an intellectual movement that prized detachment, objectivity, and skepticism. And altogether, this pushes for reform. Now, one of the other things that's going on in the background is something called, I'm going to move my picture a little bit out of the way here. Maybe not. Well, so we've got a movement going on that's called socialism. And there's a Socialist Party of America that came to its peak during the Progressive Era. They're led by a charismatic man named Eugene V. Debs. You'll definitely want to read about him in your book. His magazine, Appeal to Reason, had 750,000 subscribers. Whoops. There we go. He had 750,000 subscribers to his weekly magazine. And in the magazine, he published Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. The Jungle's an interesting thing because it purports to be the true and unvarnished story of Upton Sinclair's time working in a meatpacking plant. On that level, as an absolute piece of truth, it's a total lie. It's not true. He was caught in many places where he was exaggerating things, describing things in a way that they simply did not happen. Or if you read the book, you'll see there are a number of places where he talks about machines, and he clearly doesn't understand them and may not have actually seen them. This is a bad habit that documentarians and people like Sinclair, muckrakers, will get into. If the story isn't good enough, well, you can just exaggerate it a little bit. After all, it's all for the general good. You're saving society. Well, that left aside, there were real problems, and Sinclair's The Jungle absolutely horrified people. Now, it also needs to be mentioned, socialism in America at this time is being used in a very different way than it's used typically. For example, according to the Oxford Dictionary, socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization that advocates the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. In other words, you're a socialist if you believe the government should control the economy. Its opposite is laissez-faire capitalism. Now, modern Americans, and particularly people who call them socialists today, frequently use socialism in a slightly different manner. And this is very much an area where there are a lot of gray areas. Americans typically mean having some degree of government control over the economy or over businesses as socialism. This leads to a lot of confusion because socialists in other places use socialism in very different ways. And we'll talk about some of those a little bit later on. And that's why you can get someone like Bernie Sanders who says he's a socialist, and somebody like, well, Benito Mussolini, who very accurately and truly said that he was a socialist. The two men have virtually no ideas in common, other than that they think the government should have a say in the economy. So keep that in mind. Anyway, back to the progressives. There became a close tie between socialists and progressives. And although most progressives never quite become socialists, and you do have radical and sometimes Marxist socialists. And eventually we'll talk a little bit about Marxism. Now, there are a couple of motives for progressivism that do set it apart. Particularly this early 20th century progressivism is very closely tied to religion, and a very specific religion. It's evangelical Protestantism. And this is partly because of the social gospel. And part of the social gospel, which was a trend that ministers included in sermons, very typically, the social gospel said Christians have a duty to rid the world of sin, poverty, inequality, and greed. There's also, very separately from religion, a faith in rationality and scientific progress. Pardon me. This was developed as the social sciences developed, and people said the social sciences are now at a point where experts could rationalize society and the economy, making it both more efficient and more fair. The great movement of the 19th century was classical liberalism and laissez-faire capitalism, which said, in part, that the government is not rational enough and not capable of managing the economy as efficiently as the economy running it itself. So in some ways, 20th century socialism and the progressives are actually going back to an even older political movement, the movement of... Pardon me, I'm going to have to pause here for a sec. Sorry about that sudden coughing fit. But the movement they're going back to is mercantilism, which was an older economic theory that was based on the idea that the government should control the economy, but unlike socialism, it's for the betterment of the government itself. This is the economic theory that dominated the world before the development of capitalism. And yes, I have cats. So we're knocking things down. So one of the other things that needs to be remembered is in the 19th century, there was the belief in separate spheres. That's that Women were too fragile to compete in the workplace, and they needed to be protected and essentially locked in at home. In return for control over the home and raising children, women gave up most careers. By the early 20th century, women were finding that they didn't like this arrangement. And women, pardon me again, many times in pursuit of traditionally female areas of interest, child rearing or maintaining homes, women found themselves leaving the home and pushing moralities. So, pardon me, women have come to see themselves as the bearers of morality. And as part of the progressive movement, they're very much going to take up this torch. A good example of this is the temperance movement. Now, this was not a new movement in the early 20th century. It had been prevalent in the United States before the Civil War. But by the turn of the century, the WCTU had 250,000 members. There's an anti-saloon league who are trying to close saloons all over the U.S. And you have people like Carrie A. Nation who take radical steps. Carrie Nation was about 6 foot tall, 175-pound woman, a very large woman. And what she would do is go into bars and actually smash them up with her axes. Fun story. She visited Peoria, Illinois, which was known as the wettest county in Illinois, the one with the most alcohol, several times. At one time, she attempted to smash up a bar. In this particular case, she ran afoul of the owner of the bar. At this time, most men weren't willing to touch a woman, even if she was attacking their bar with an axe. They would call the police, she would be arrested. In Peoria, though, she attacked a bar that was run by a woman, a widow, whose husband, the original owner of the bar, had passed away, leaving it to her. And, well, Carrie A. Nation was a big woman, nearly 6 foot tall. She was bigger than most men at the time. The barkeeper in Peoria was 6'3". According to legend, and I can't find proof of this one, but it's a story passed down in Peoria. According to legend, she actually snapped Carrie A. Nation's axe handle over her knee. The bar owners, not Carrie A. Nation's. That would probably hurt a lot. Actually, in either case. Either way, Carrie A. Nation is a good example of how radical and how aggressive the progressives could be. Keep that in mind while you're watching current political events. And as you read ahead in the book, keep in mind this is the background, this is the basic theory that people are thinking about at the time. And think how similar it is in some of its root causes and base assumptions to some of the modern political movements you're seeing today. We'll talk more about that a little later on. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. And let me repeat, again, I'm sorry that this came out a little bit late, but hopefully it was worth waiting for. And if you run into any problems with assignments, do send me a text message. My phone number is in, pardon me, on Blackboard in your syllabus. And I'd better go because I think my cats are breaking everything in my house.